Imagine the scene. It is October 1941. The German Wehrmacht, after this incredible summer campaign, seemingly unstoppable, stands less than a day's drive from Moscow.
Right, incredibly close.
And this isn't just any city. This is the absolute nerve center of the Soviet Union. I mean, the political, military, communications hub, everything.
It's the prize. For Hitler, the thinking wasn't if Moscow would fall. It was really just a matter of when.
That confidence, maybe overconfidence, was fueled by those massive victories since June, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The Axis High Command, they genuinely believed the war on the Eastern Front was basically hours, maybe days, from being decided in their favor.
And that's the setup for what we're diving into today. Because what happens over the next, 3 months? October 41 to January 42. It's this massive military clash, the Battle of Moscow.
And it's pivotal. It doesn't just save the city, it saves the Soviet state itself, really. And crucially, it shatters that German myth of a quick, decisive war.
Yeah, the blitzkrieg concept sort of hits a wall.
A very cold, very muddy wall. It forces the Wehrmacht into this long, grinding war of attrition that, frankly, they weren't really equipped for, logistically or strategically.
So our mission today is to really get a handle on this crucial turning point. We're looking at the German offensive, Operation Typhoon,
Right.
and how it starts with this near-total Soviet collapse, but then flips dramatically into the Wehrmacht's first major strategic defeat.
The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Moscow had fallen, well, it's hard to imagine Soviet resistance continuing in the same way. It might have just fractured completely.
Okay, let's unpack this. The road to Moscow was, as you said, paved with German confidence, but also just unbelievable levels of Soviet destruction. But maybe the problems for the Germans started even before they got close to the city.
That's a really key point. The seeds of the eventual failure were sown much earlier, even amidst those stunning initial successes. Yeah, to grasp the sheer crisis Moscow faced, you have to rewind just a bit to June 41, the start of Operation Barbarossa.
The invasion itself.
Exactly. The original German plan was incredibly ambitious. Ruthlessly so. They expected to capture Moscow within, 4 months? Using pure blitzkrieg tactics, speed, encirclement, the whole package.
And initially it looked like they might actually pull it off.
Oh, absolutely. The early gains were staggering. Deep penetrations into Soviet territory, much of the Soviet Air Force wiped out on the ground in the first few days.
Right.
Army Group Center crossed the Dnieper, captured Smolensk by mid-July. I mean, everything seemed ahead of schedule.
So if they were moving that fast, why the pause? Why did Army Group Center, the main thrust towards Moscow, halt when the capital seemed almost within reach? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, from a purely military standpoint. And that's where Hitler's personal intervention comes in.
Yeah.
Most military thinking says you go for the capital, the command center, the center of gravity.
That's what the generals wanted, right?
Yeah.
Von Brockisch, Halder.
Yes, precisely. They argued strongly for a direct push on Moscow. But Hitler had a different view. He believed the Soviet Union was fundamentally weak, a sort of house of cards, and the best way to make it collapse was to hit its economic base first.
Resources over the capital.
That was his calculation. He saw Moscow as secondary, initially. The real prize, he thought, was Ukraine. The food, the minerals, the industry down there. That was the key to breaking the USSR economically.
So he pulls vital panzer divisions away from the central push and sends them south.
He does. And when his generals objected, arguing for Moscow, Hitler apparently dismissed their concerns quite forcefully. Reportedly said something like, only ossified brains could think of such an idea when economic victory seemed so close.
Ossified brains. Wow. Okay, but you have to admit that turn south towards Kyiv was a huge tactical success, wasn't it?
Tactically. Spectacular. One of the biggest encirclements in military history up to that point. The Germans claimed nearly 700,000 Red Army prisoners by late September. It effectively destroyed Soviet defenses in the entire southwestern front.
But the cost?
The cost was strategic. That diversion south took Army Group Center out of the main fight for Moscow for almost 8 weeks. 8 crucial weeks.
Right when the weather was still relatively good.
Exactly. The blitzkrieg momentum just dissipated. Right. And those weeks were a gift to the Soviets, to Stavikaya, their high command. It gave them precious, desperate time to scrape together new armies, pull units from other fronts, and, critically, start building those deep defensive lines around Moscow.
So, a massive victory in Ukraine, but maybe at the cost of the decisive blow against Moscow itself.
That's the trade-off, yeah. And by the time Hitler finally gave the go-ahead for Operation Typhoon, the renewed push on Moscow, the situation had changed. The forces involved were still huge, though.
What kind of numbers are we talking about for Typhoon's start?
Well, the Germans threw up to 2 million men into it. 3 infantry armies, 3 panzer groups, the elite armored formations, thousands of tanks. But, and this is important, these troops weren't fresh. They'd been fighting hard all summer.
And their air support. You mentioned the Soviet Air Force was hit hard initially.
It was, but so was the Luftwaffe. By October, Luftflotte 2, the air fleet supporting Army Group Center, had taken significant losses. They could only muster around 549 serviceable aircraft for Typhoon. That's not a lot, considering the scale of the operation.
That lack of air superiority must have hampered the Blitzkrieg style.
Definitely. Blitzkrieg relies heavily on that tight air-ground coordination. Starting with a depleted air arm was a definite disadvantage.
And on the Soviet side, facing this onslaught,
They had 3 main fronts army groups,
Well.
basically deployed along the Vyazma and Bryansk defensive line, maybe 1.25 million men in total. Fewer tanks than the Germans initially, but concentrated and fighting on home turf.
So Typhoon kicks off late September, early October.
Right, September 30th, October 2nd. And initially, it's another devastating success for the Germans. Classic Blitzkrieg.
This is where we see those huge encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. It sounds like a repeat of Kiev, almost.
It was horrifyingly effective. The 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups executed these perfect pincer movements. They linked up near Vyazma on October 10th, trapping 4, maybe parts of 5, Soviet armies.
The numbers captured were just staggering.
German High Command claimed over 670,000 Soviet prisoners from both the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets combined. Modern research adjusts that down a bit, maybe closer to 514,000 captured. But still
an unbelievable number.
It meant that in one swift operation, the Soviets lost something like 41% of the troops defending the direct approaches to Moscow.
That must have sealed it in the minds of the German leadership. Game over.
It really did seem that way. Confidence or maybe arrogance was peaking. Goebbels' propaganda ministry was quoting Hitler on October 9th, basically saying the Red Army defending Moscow was already finished, just a matter of mopping up.
And morale back home in Germany?
Shot up. People genuinely started talking about the soldiers being home by Christmas. The leadership really believed the Soviet Union had finally run out of men, that its reserves were exhausted. And what's fascinating here is this absolute conviction of victory, born from these early successes, it blinded them. It masked the reality of their own troops' exhaustion. And crucially, it meant they weren't prepared for what came next. 2 big things.
Which were?
First, the weather. And second, a nasty surprise in terms of Soviet equipment.
Let's talk weather first. The infamous Rasputitsa.
The mud.
Yeah, the season of bad roads. It arrived almost on cue. First snow around October 7th, which then melted, turning the entire landscape, especially the unpaved roads the Germans relied on, into this deep, sticky, impassable mud, a quagmire.
How bad was it for German vehicles? Well, we think of panzers, but a lot of their supply was horse-drawn or wheeled trucks, right?
Exactly. The panzers could handle mud better, but the supply columns couldn't move. Wheeled trucks just sank up to their axles, horses struggled and died. The German logistics system, already stretched thin, basically dissolved. So it wasn't just slowing them down, it was potentially starving the front lines of fuel, ammo, food.
Precisely. The Rasputitsa lasted for weeks, grinding the advance to a crawl, sometimes a complete halt. And that pause, forced by nature, was Moscow's lifeline. It gave those retreating Soviet units, the survivors of Vyazma and Bryansk, a chance to fall back and man the next line of defenses without constant German pressure nipping at their heels.
And while the Germans are literally stuck in the mud, they get another shock. The T-34 tank.
This was huge, a genuine technological and psychological blow. It happened near Mozhaisk around October 6th. A Soviet force, including Mikhail Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade, ambushed elements of the German 4th Panzer Division.
And the Germans discovered their weapons weren't very effective.
Worse than that, they discovered the new Soviet T-34 tank was almost invulnerable to their standard anti-tank guns and even their main battle tanks at normal combat ranges.
What made the T-34 so good?
It was a combination of factors. Really innovative sloped armor, which made incoming shells much more likely to deflect.
A concept the Germans hadn't really embraced yet.
Not like the Soviets had, no. Plus, it had a powerful 76.2 millimeter gun that could easily knock out German Panzer IIIs and Hivers. And it was relatively fast and mechanically reliable.
General Guderian, the Blitzkrieg expert, he was there, right? What was his take?
Gagarin saw it immediately. He was a tanker. He understood the implications. He later wrote about it, noting that their main tank, the Panzer IV with its short 75 millimeter gun, could basically only hope to knock out a T-34 by hitting the engine compartment from the rear. A very difficult shot.
So the T-34 could engage German tanks from ranges where the Germans couldn't effectively fight back.
Pretty much. It was a massive tactical disadvantage. Guderian and others sent urgent reports back to Berlin demanding better tanks, better guns. Yeah. This T-34 shock directly led to the development of the German Panther and Tiger tanks.
But that was much later. Too late for Moscow.
Way too late for Moscow. So you have mud stalling the advance, and the tanks they do encounter suddenly seem terrifyingly superior. Meanwhile, in Moscow itself, absolute panic.
This is when Georgy Zhukov arrives, recalled from Leningrad.
Yes. Zhukov takes command of the Moscow defenses, the combined Western and Reserve fronts, on October 10th. And he arrives to find a situation bordering on chaos.
What state were the defenses in? They were building the Mozhaisk line, right?
They were frantically trying to build it. It was planned as this deep four-layered defense system. But the reality Zhukov found was grim. There were maybe only 90,000 actual combat soldiers available to man this vast stretch, hundreds of kilometers long. The lines were incredibly thin.
So the defense relied heavily on civilians.
Massively. It was an extraordinary effort, really. Reports mention 250,000 civilians, mostly women and teenagers, being mobilized.
Just with shovels, basically.
Pretty much. Digging trenches, anti-tank ditches, fortifications, moving millions of cubic meters of earth by hand. Factories in the city were rapidly converted too, like an automobile plant suddenly starts churning out submachine guns, whatever it took.
But amidst this physical effort, there was political panic too. The government evacuation.
Yes, that was a critical moment. Around October 15th, Stalin ordered the Communist Party leadership, the government ministries, the general staff, almost the entire state apparatus to evacuate to Kuybyshev, way off to the east in Samara.
And word got out.
It did, and it caused absolute chaos in Moscow. Civilians panicked. There were reports of people storming train stations trying to get out, roads jammed, solid, even some looting and breakdown of order. It looked like the city itself might collapse from within.
But Stalin himself stayed.
He did. And that decision was probably one of the most important single acts of the battle. Stalin publicly remained in the Kremlin. His presence, while the rest of the government fled, had this huge symbolic impact. It helped calm the panic somewhat and showed a resolve that resonated with the troops at the front.
Okay, so the Soviets are digging in, Stalin stays. But the Germans, once the ground firmed up a bit, they started moving again, didn't they? Late October.
They did. The Wehrmacht resumed its offensive push. They captured key points on that Mozhaisk line, Mozhaisk itself, Maloroslavets, Volokolamsk. They were grinding forward again, especially trying to push past Tula in the south to encircle Moscow.
Tula was important.
Very important. A big industrial city controlling the southern approach. But the German attack on Tula, around October 29th, was beaten back. Fierce resistance from the Soviet 50th Army and, again, civilian volunteer units.
And that resistance, combined with the mud and logistics, basically stopped the Germans for October.
Yes. By October 31st, operations ground to a halt again. They were bogged down by Tula's defense, their own exhaustion, ongoing supply nightmares, and the persistent mud. The first phase of Typhoon was effectively over.
Going into November, the situation must have been desperate on both sides, but the Germans were really feeling the strain by now.
Oh, absolutely. The logistical situation for the Germans was just dire. Reports from Army Group Center indicated maybe only a third of their trucks and motor vehicles were even operational. Breakdowns, combat losses, mud.
And the troops themselves.
Infantry divisions were down to maybe half strength on average. And crucially, the winter gear still hadn't arrived in sufficient quantities. They were facing the Russian winter in summer uniforms.
Yet the Soviets put on a show of defiance. That famous Red Square parade on November 7th.
Incredible moment. Revolution Day. Stalin orders the traditional military parade to go ahead right there in Red Square, with German forces maybe 70, 80 kilometers away.
And the troops marched straight to the front.
Many of them did. First divisions, including some of those Siberian units starting to arrive, marched past Lenin's mausoleum, past Stalin, and then straight out of the city towards the battle lines. It was an immense display of resolve, broadcast to the world, a calculated gamble, but it worked psychologically.
And then the weather turned again. The ground froze.
It's November. The mud turned to iron-hard frozen ruts, and this gave the Germans one last chance. It allowed their tanks and vehicles to move again, albeit slowly. This triggered the final, desperate German pincer attack on Moscow.
What was the plan this time?
Still a double envelopment, a strong push from the north, aiming for Klin and Solnechnogorsk, trying to cut off Moscow from the north and east. And another push from the south, trying to bypass Tula this time, heading towards Kashira and Kolumna to complete the encirclement.
And they got terrifyingly close this time, didn't they?
dangerously close. In the north, the German 7th Panzer Division actually managed to seize a bridgehead across the Moscow-Volga Canal. That was on November 27th. They were less than 35 kilometers, about 22 miles from the Kremlin.
That's the point where you hear stories about German soldiers seeing the spires of the Kremlin.
That specific instance usually refers to December 2nd. A forward reconnaissance battalion from one of the panzer divisions reached the outskirts of a town called Khimki.
How far is Khimki?
It's roughly 30 kilometers, maybe 19 miles northwest of the Kremlin. Some officers claim they could see the larger buildings of Moscow through their field glasses. That was it. That was the absolute closest point the Wehrmacht ever got to the center of Moscow.
And right at that moment of maximum advance, the Russian winter hits. Properly hits.
Hits with a vengeance. The winter of 1941-42 was exceptionally brutal, one of the coldest on record for the 20th century.
What kind of temperatures are we talking? We hear figures like -40.
Yeah, some commanders reported extreme lows like -45 degrees C, probably factoring in wind chill and exposed positions. Official meteorological records show the lowest recorded temperature in December was around -28.8 degrees Trillium. But even that is devastatingly cold if you're not prepared.
And the Germans were not prepared.
Not at all. The lack of winter clothing was catastrophic. Over 130,000 cases of severe frostbite were officially reported just in Army Group Center during this period, leading to countless amputations. Men were literally freezing to death in their positions.
And the equipment. Blitzkrieg relies on machines.
The cold crippled the machines. Standard German lubricants froze solid. Engines wouldn't start without hours of preheating, often with dangerous open fires. Weapons jammed the oil and rifle bolts, machine guns, even artillery breech blocks froze.
Did the Soviets face the same problems?
To some extent, yes, it was brutally cold for everyone. But Soviet equipment was generally designed to be simpler, more robust, and used lubricants formulated for extreme cold. And crucially, their troops did have proper winter clothing, felt boots, Falenki, padded jackets, telegrekas, fur hats. They were prepared for winter warfare in a way the Germans simply weren't.
There's that grim detail about how they sometimes improved their gear.
Yeah, it's a stark illustration of the conditions. Soviet soldiers were often better equipped, but sometimes if they needed better boots or a warmer coat, they would recover them from fallen German soldiers. They'd have to thaw the bodies out first. It speaks volumes about the desperation and the value placed on adequate winter clothing.
So the final German push wasn't really stopped by a single battle, but by this combination of exhaustion, resistance, logistics failure, and now the crippling cold.
It was a complete system failure. The advance sputtered out. The decision to formally halt came around December 5th. General Guderian, commanding the southern pincer, recognized the futility. His tanks were immobilized, his men were freezing and starving. He essentially called off the attack on his own initiative to prevent a complete catastrophe.
He wrote something about that, didn't he?
He did. He noted in his diary, "The offensive on Moscow failed. I stopped my troops on 5 December, otherwise the catastrophe would be unavoidable." The German army had pushed itself to and beyond its absolute limit.
So the Germans grind to a halt, utterly exhausted. But their high command still seems to think the Soviets must be in even worse shape, right? That their reserves are gone.
That was the critical miscalculation by German intelligence. They assessed that the Red Army had thrown everything into the defense and had nothing left. They were disastrously wrong.
This is where the Siberian divisions come in.
Exactly, the ace up Stalin's sleeve. The Soviet Union had substantial, well-trained forces stationed in the Far East, guarding against a potential Japanese attack.
But they needed confirmation Japan wasn't going to attack.
And they got it, thanks to incredible intelligence work. Most famously from Richard Sorge, a Soviet spy operating at the highest levels in Tokyo. Sorge confirmed that Japan's strategic focus was shifting south, towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and they had no immediate plans to invade Siberia.
That information must have been pure gold for Stalin.
Absolutely game-changing. Once he felt confident Japan wasn't an immediate threat, Stalin began this massive, secret transfer of troops from the Far East to the Moscow front.
How many troops are we talking about?
Over 18 full divisions initially, plus around 1,700 tanks and 1,500 aircraft. And crucially, these weren't raw recruits.
No, these were soldiers trained for.
Trained specifically for winter warfare. Many were Siberians, expert skiers, acclimatized to extreme cold, fully equipped with the best winter gear. They were battle-hardened, experienced troops, originally positioned to fight the Japanese in Manchuria.
So while the Germans were freezing and running out of steam, the Soviets were quietly massing fresh, winter-specialized forces right under their noses.
Precisely. By early December, Stavka had managed to assemble this powerful reserve force, maybe 58 divisions in total, combining the Far Eastern troops with others and deploy them very carefully, maintaining secrecy. The Germans had no idea what was about to hit them.
And when they hit hard. The counteroffensive kicks off almost immediately after Guderian halts his advance, December 5th, 6th.
Right on the heels of the German halt. The Kalinin front attacked on the 5th. The western and southwestern fronts joined in on the 6th. The initial goal was straightforward: remove the immediate threat to Moscow.
How quickly did they make gains? Were the Germans able to hold?
The German lines were stretched incredibly thin. The soldiers were exhausted and frozen. They simply couldn't withstand the sudden onslaught of fresh, well-equipped Soviet forces hitting them at specific weak points. The Soviets achieved local superiority, often 2-to-1 or more, where they attacked.
So breakthroughs were quick.
Very quick in places. Solnechny-Gorsk was retaken by December 12th, Klin on December 15th. These were key towns northwest of Moscow that the Germans had captured just weeks before. The northern pincer was being rolled back.
And in the south, around Tula, where Guderian had been pushing.
That was also a major focus. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army was still trying to maneuver even after halting the main advance. The fight for Kashira, southeast of Moscow, was vital because the Soviet Western Front HQ was located nearby.
How did the Soviets counter that?
Stavy KA reacted decisively. They threw in reserves like Major General Pavel Belov's 1st Guards Cavalry Corps, yes, cavalry, highly mobile in snow, and the 112th Tank Division. These forces hit the flank of the 2nd Panzer Army hard.
And pushed them back.
Drove them back about 40 kilometers, securing Kashira and effectively ending any lingering German threat to Moscow from the south. It was a combination of tanks, cavalry, and ski troops outmaneuvering the bogged-down panzers.
So the whole momentum shifts. The Germans aren't attacking anymore. They're desperate, trying not to be routed.
Completely. The liberation of Tula itself on December 16th was a huge moment, both strategically and morally. From there, the Soviet push continued. Narofominsk, Kaluga, Maloyer-Sovets were all retaken by early January. The front line was being pushed steadily westward, away from the capital.
What about the air war during this counteroffensive? Did the Luftwaffe recover?
Initially, they were still hampered by the extreme cold in mid-December. Reports of nectar 42 degrees C grounded most aircraft. But as conditions eased slightly into January, the Luftwaffe was reinforced and played a really critical role.
In slowing the Soviet advance.
Yes, primarily in preventing the German retreat from turning into a total collapse. They provided vital close air support to the beleaguered German ground troops, hitting Soviet columns, destroying tanks and vehicles, hundreds around Tula alone. They couldn't stop the Soviet advance, but they definitely slowed it down and helped Army Group Center establish some kind of coherent defensive line further back.
This defeat, the first major setback for the Wehrmacht, it must have sent shockwaves through the German high command, especially back to Hitler.
Oh, the reaction was volcanic. Hitler had already issued Directive 39 on December 8th, ordering a switch to the defensive. But as the scale of the Soviet counterattack became clear, his field commanders Guderian, von Klug, others started pleading for permission to make tactical withdrawals.
To shorten the line, consolidate, maybe find better defensive positions. Makes sense militarily.
Perfect military sense. The line was too long, the troops too exposed and exhausted. But Hitler saw any retreat as weakness, as the beginning of a Napoleonic disaster.
Else he refused.
Absolutely refused. On December 20th, he issued his infamous stand fast order, no withdrawals, defend every inch of ground. He essentially equated retreat with treason.
And this led to direct conflict with his general.
A major clash. Hitler believed the crisis was caused by a lack of willpower, not military reality. This led directly to the purge of the high command.
Who got fired?
The commander-in-chief of the army, Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, was dismissed on December 19th, ostensibly for health reasons, but really because he'd lost Hitler's confidence. Then General Guderian, who argued most forcefully for withdrawal to save his troops, was relieved of command on Christmas Day. Generals Hübner and Strauss, commanders of panzer groups, were also dismissed soon after.
And Hitler steps in himself.
He does. He takes personal command of the army, He sidelined the professional general staff to a large extent. From this point on, Hitler increasingly dictates not just grand strategy, but operational and even tactical decisions, often overruling experienced commanders on the ground.
Which many historians see as a turning point in how Germany waged the war.
A hugely significant turning point. Having the supreme leader, surrounded by often sycophantic staff officers with little recent combat experience, making rigid, often ideologically driven decisions. It arguably sealed Germany's fate in the long run.
But in the short term, the Soviet success was clear. How far back were the Germans pushed?
By the time the initial Soviet counteroffensive culminated in early January 1942, they had pushed Army Group Center back anywhere from 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow, depending on the sector. A massive strategic victory.
The first time the Wehrmacht had been decisively stopped and pushed back on such a scale.
Exactly. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. It proved the Soviet Union wasn't defeated, wasn't collapsing, and it fundamentally changed the nature of the war on the Eastern Front, guaranteeing it would be a long, bloody conflict.
When we talk about a battle this enormous, the human cost is always immense. What are the casualty estimates, though I know they're often debated?
They are incredibly difficult to pin down accurately, especially because there's debate about where the Battle of Moscow officially ends and subsequent related offenses like the Richa battles begin.
Just for the main period, October 41 to January 42.
For the initial defensive phase up to December 5th, Soviet losses killed, wounded, missing, captured are often estimated at over 650,000. If you include the counteroffensive phase up to early January, the total Soviet losses likely exceeded 1 million men. Just staggering figures.
And German losses?
Official Wehrmacht casualty reports for Army Group Center during this period were around 174,000. But almost everyone agrees this is a significant underestimate. The accounting was chaotic during the retreat, and these figures likely didn't fully capture the huge numbers incapacitated by frostbite or who simply disappeared during the fighting. The true German losses were undoubtedly much higher.
It's hard to comprehend that level of suffering on both sides. We also have to touch on the methods used, especially by the Soviets, to maintain discipline under such extreme pressure.
Yes, the victory came at a brutal internal cost as well. Soviet discipline was incredibly harsh. The policy of not one step back was enforced ruthlessly. NKVD blocking detachments were deployed behind the front lines.
With orders to shoot.
With orders to shoot any soldiers or officers seen retreating without authorization or showing cowardice. It was state-sanctioned terror used to compel resistance.
And there were other grim aspects like the self-shooters.
That's a particularly chilling detail. Soldiers desperate to escape the front would sometimes shoot themselves, often in the hand or foot, hoping for evacuation. The NKVD actively hunted for such cases in field hospitals.
And surgeons sometimes tried to protect them.
There are accounts from Soviet surgeons who admitted to performing immediate amputations on soldiers with suspicious hand wounds, claiming it was medically necessary, partly to save them from being identified as self-shooters and facing immediate execution by NKVD punishment squads. It shows the level of fear within their own ranks.
An incredible dark side to the resilience shown. So the Soviets win this crucial battle. How did they use this victory in terms of propaganda?
They moved very quickly. A documentary film was produced almost immediately titled Rout of the German Troops Near Moscow, which was released internationally, including in the U.S. under the title Moscow Strikes Back.
What did it show?
It combined actual battle footage with stark images of the consequences of the German occupation and retreat, destroyed villages, alleged atrocities, images of dead civilians, executed partisans. It was powerful propaganda, portraying the Soviets as heroic defenders against Nazi barbarity, and it was very effective in bolstering support for the Soviet Union among the Allies.
And the legacy of the battle in Russia today.
It remains arguably the defining moment of the Great Patriotic War, as they call it. Moscow was awarded the title Hero City in 1965 for its defense. And that annual military parade held on November 7th in Red Square explicitly commemorates the historic 1941 parade, symbolizing the city's and the nation's unyielding resistance. It's deeply ingrained in the national memory. #outro. So we connect this to the bigger picture. The Battle of Moscow fundamentally proved that all the key Axis assumptions about the Soviet Union were wrong. They underestimated Soviet resilience, the vastness of the country, the impact of the climate, and crucially, the depth of their reserves.
Right. It wasn't just a military planning victory for the Soviets, though Zhukov's defense was brilliant. It was also about sheer logistical survival, brutal enforcement of will, and that critical hidden deployment of the Siberian division.
Exactly. It was a complex mix of factors.
And the failure at Moscow really locked Germany into that long, attritional war on the Eastern Front that they just weren't set up for. It guarantees no swift victory, maybe guarantees they can't win the war, period.
It certainly ended any realistic hope of winning the war quickly in 1941. It forced a strategic reset they were ill-prepared for.
So this raises an important question, something for you, the listener, to think about. We talked about Hitler taking personal command after Moscow, sidelining his professional generals. What was the real long-term cost of that decision? By surrounding himself primarily with staff officers who lacked that recent brutal combat experience, did Hitler essentially lock the German war machine onto a path where even if they had tactical successes later, strategic victory became impossible? Was the war, in a sense, already lost for Germany in the snows outside Moscow because of that change in command?